Welcome to XLN3, the podcast where we talk about the plays and the players from XLNC's League of Legends tournaments. I'm your host, QuiteIndubitably, flying solo today. If you are a returning viewer, you might note this as something of an aberration. It just so turns out that I wanted to try out a few things, and this first episode of Season 2 seemed to be the time to do it, as there is quite a bit of information to simply regurgitate at you, which doesn't make for particularly scintillating conversation, and I wanted to try out a few things stylistically and technologically at the same time, so it seemed like an apt time to do it. If you happen to hear anything today you liked, please let me know, and we'll try to incorporate it more into our more typical content. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right into things. All right, this is the segment which is essentially a listicle. If you have been following XLNC on Twitter at all, you might have noticed that we have a truly mind-boggling amount of new teams joining us this season between Mid and Heavy League. Emphasis on Mid League though, because Mid League is basically all new faces. This is something that's really quite surprising to see. I can't say I was expecting this degree of just new players, but here we are. So in an attempt to familiarize ourselves with the teams that we will be seeing throughout this season, I'm going to list all of the mid-league teams at you just right now. So hopefully when you see them streamed, there will be a little piece of the back of your brain which says to you, I recognize those guys. Don't know why though. So without further ado, in mid-league we shall be seeing this season Glaive Esports Rose, Legendary Wolves, Omega Gaming Unleashed, Degenerate Exiles, Darkside, Meme City Esports Rush, Divine Ascension Ruby, Anarchy Lime, One Brain Boys, and AoE God Squad. So only time will tell exactly what playstyles these teams will have, what players they decide to position as their star carries. But in the meantime, there are a couple questions I would like to ask. First of all, of the One Brain Boys, which boy gets the one brain? And did Degenerate Exiles intend me to call them degenerates? Because I think the on-stream team went with Exiles as their shorthand for this team name, but in my notes, I wrote degenerates a lot. So if you hear me calling these players degenerates, I promise this is not a value judgment. This is a side effect of their name, which I dare suspect they anticipated when they decided to pick that name. So let's move on to our Heavy League teams. In Heavy League, we have Akuma Glaives, Glaive Amethyst, FGCU Thunderbirds, our returning champions Vlad Banners only, YO Boomers, Bucky Stratosphere, New Age, Lotus, Catalyst Blaze, and Orbital Crow. Now, you might recall that Catalyst Blaze is in fact a returning team, but not a returning team to Heavy League, no. They are moving up from Mid-League, now attempting to test their mettle against heavier competition. So it almost kind of feels like a crossover, and I'm excited to see them competing in Heavy League this season. This out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the games that were streamed. All right, so if you were here with us last season, you might recall that last season's games were streamed as sets of 3, where some of those sets would turn into duos and therefore only 2 games would be streamed. Well, not this time, as we are streaming 2 back-to-back sets of 2 for each league. So you tune into Mid-League, you get 4 games. You turn into Heavy League, you get 4 games. This is a more consistent number of games per week that we'll get to see, and that also gives us extra content, which is fun to see as a viewer, although my heart does go out to the production teams involved. So, Mid-League saw their first stream games as the 2 set between Degenerate Exiles and Darkside. Now, my heart immediately goes out to Degenerate Exiles here, as through a number of shenanigans, they lost their first 3 bans. Now, in competitions, we have rules that levy penalties like bans, but it's not that anyone really enjoys enforcing those. At the end of the day, you can never stop an emergency or an unforeseen happenstance. And I'm not entirely sure all of what exactly happened to Degenerate Exiles, but I know at the end of it, they lost 3 bans and had 2 subs playing along with a bit of a role shift. So Shockblade subbed in for Starman as the support. The ADC is someone that we referred to as Yellow Snow on stream, but in fact, the account he was playing on was just a bunch of Z's and X's. One of his accounts is permabanned and the other got 14 dayed. Yellow Snow, what are you doing? Are you toxic? Do you need help being less toxic? I can help you. Just let me know, buddy. Anyhow, Jisoo is regularly slated to play top lane for Degenerate Exiles. However, Pyrocryptic subbed in for the top lane and Jisoo shifted down to jungle. So anything that we saw in week 1 may not necessarily be indicative of how Degenerate Exiles wants to play or in fact does play. In this first game, Darkseid gets their hands on Malphite, Ivern, Yasuo, Swain, and Nautilus. That's right, Swain Nautilus bot lane. The old Scratch really does like playing Jhin, and for whatever reason, and maybe it's because they have pretty good synergy together, but I have noticed that it seems that a lot of the people who are willing to play Swain bot are Jhin players, and I don't know if I'm just imagining this or not, but it is a scary thing to see. Degenerate Exiles, suffering from their loss of 3 bans, managed to pull together a Karma, Kindred, Galio, Jhin, and Seraphine, which you might notice is a very one-dimensionally scaling comp, especially for a team that lost their bans. This is a composition that leaves them very open to just being trampled over if they lose the early game, which is kind of what happens here. See, as you might expect from a team that has an Ivern in it, who, all junglers really like invading for early vision. Information for jungle pathing is extraordinarily valuable, but Ivern in particular tends to love it because Ivern is a little bit of a cheesy champion when it comes to pathing and often tries to take invades that if the other enemy was really sure about Ivern being there, they just really get these really easy collapse kills onto the Ivern. So Ivern is particularly incentivized to try to get some information if he wants to try going for any of those cheeky invades. So Darkseid does stack all of their 5 players into the top lane to waltz in with their Ivern, and on the way they happen to meet Pyrocryptic on Karma and secure a first blood for crits on Yasuo. Now, no one likes giving over first blood to Yasuo, but in particular, against this comp of Degenerate Exiles, which is so dependent on scaling and so vulnerable in the early stages, this is just a dream come true for Darkseid. This is really not a favorable position for Degenerate Exiles to be in, and the game has barely started. Now, the game continues to go downhill, and it doesn't take long for the next misfortune to beset the Degenerate Exiles, as Ivern ganks bot early. Jhin and Seraphine are very pushed up, and Darkseid gets an easy kill onto the Seraphine. Now, I would argue that this right here is a very questionable occurrence for the Degenerate Exiles to have allowed to have happen. See, if they did not know, they ought to have at least suspected that Ivern wanted to start in Degenerate Exiles topside start with an invade, which is what happened, by the way. And Ivern is the kind of jungler who likes to clear some early camps and then immediately start ganking. Ivern is a champion who loves ganking early, does it basically every game. I can't think of a situation in which an Ivern is not trying to just waltz into a lane at the first available opportunity, which happens to quite reliably be whatever opposite side of the map that Ivern started on. I mean, sometimes Iverns will gank mid, but I very often see just sort of bot to ganking top or start top to ganking bot. And that's what happened here. I really do think the Degenerate Exiles should have had it in the back of their minds that Ivern was likely enough to attempt that gank bot after what they saw in that invade. Perhaps Jhin and Seraphine were lulled into a false sense of security insofar as their kindred was also bot side at the time, but Jisoo was tied up and taking his camps at that moment was definitely not available to rotate, and certainly not in the time that Zongi did manage to gank on Ivern. I mean, he just waltzed into that bot lane from the river, and it made for quite the easy engage between a Nautilus and an Ivern to catch out that Seraphine and get some more gold onto Dark Side. Now, this had just barely happened, and just a minute, probably I think just less than 2 minutes after this occurs, Jisoo tries to bully Zongi in his own jungle and gets collapsed on. This happens to hand some extra gold onto Yasuo. And at this point, let's be honest, the game is basically over. Darkseid really takes over. This is Yasuo with some nice early kills that he just uses to trample all over the, again, very vulnerable composition that Degenerate Exiles is fielding here. It really should be no surprise that Degenerate Exiles gets a clean Drake sweep. And yeah, they do win that game there. So let's move on to game 2, where Degenerate Exiles gets all of their bans. They ban out Yasuo after seeing Crit's performance, and I can't say I blame them. No one likes an enemy team Yasuo, after all. Something that I must question about the draft is they also attempt to take Coach's Malphite away from him, and Malphite Yasuo is an obnoxious combination for sure, but I can't say that I think Malphite is a sufficient threat that you would want to take him away after you've already banned out the possibility of a Yasuo. I mean, I don't see Malphite as a particularly strong pick right now, and after glancing at both Pyrocryptic and Coach's OP.GGs, I don't necessarily have all their accounts, but it doesn't seem to me like Malphite is a particular pocket pick for either of those players. So part of me does wonder why Degenerate Exiles seemed so keen on getting their hands on that Malphite, especially since it did not happen to serve them particularly well into Coach's Ornn, because Coach actually does get the first blood on Ornn into that Malphite. It happens at level 6. This game is already, as you can tell, not quite so much as an unfortunate fiesta as game 1 was. It does start out a bit more slowly, but Darkseid does do a quite impressive job of stacking up a gold difference nonetheless. A fair amount of that is simply the CS difference that Coach manages to get over Pyrocryptic. And there is a pivotal fight that occurs around 20 minutes, where up to that point, Darkseid has amassed about 3,000 gold over Degenerate Exiles. But let's talk about that decisive fight. See, Degenerate Exiles essentially baits Darkseid into taking this fight in the bot lane, and it's not quite so obvious a bait, but Jisoo manages to find himself in a comfortable hiding spot in the bot lane bush with a control ward, and just sort of chills there for a moment, waits it out to see what Darkseid will do, and Darkseid does spy what appears to be some extra easy gold, and they do greed for this fight that, by all means, to them looks like a good fight. Well, it isn't. It just so happens that Degenerate Exiles calls in a couple of teleports. And I say a couple of teleports. You only really need one, don't you? And turns this fight that Darkseid takes, and they pile all of their kills onto exactly the right player. Yellow Snow is on Kai'Sa this game. So Degenerate Exiles in this one fight manages to get Darkseid to just fork over their entire gold lead and pile that directly on to the carry. Degenerate Exiles is playing Malphite, Graves, Orianna, Kai'Sa, and Leona, which I think is a particularly smart response to some of the problems that occurred in Game 1, where while basically every marksman is useless when behind, in particular, that bot lane from Game 1 really can't do anything at all when they get behind. At least with Kai'Sa Leona, I don't know if this is just my own opinion, but it really is striking to me that Kai'Sa really just seems to become a monster at the drop of a hat in the way that other carries don't. And if you are thinking more explicitly about when she's getting her upgrades, perhaps you get less caught off guard by this than I tend to. But it seems to me that I can do all of this work to shut down a Kai'Sa early, and I think, Kai'Sa won't be a problem. And then some fool on my team just feeds her a little bit of gold, and suddenly she's a monster, and I'm like, wait, but I won lane. It's really quite obnoxious to play against. And recall that Kai'Sa is doing quite well in this meta. Leona in particular, though, enough of her tankiness comes from her base stats that even a Leona who has solidly lost lane, so long as the rest of her team is holding on all right, with the right kind of ultimate chain CC team fight, Leona can be responsible for really turning her own life around quite early in the mid-game in a way that a lot of other supports and even tank supports can often struggle with, being behind enough to not survive particularly long. So I do like this draft from Exiles. And as I mentioned before, Darkseid did find themselves on an Ornn this game. I should mention that they also have a Volibear jungle, a Corgi mid, and a Jhin Morgana bot lane. Jhin is, of course, the old Scratch's ADC of choice. No one enjoys playing against Jhin Morgana, of course. I will say, though, in low elo, it is observed that Morgana tends to completely trash Leona, but especially in competitive play, and really, it doesn't take too far up the ranked ladder to see this occur in solo queue as well. Morgana isn't a particularly strong counter to Leona, just because Leona has so much she can throw at a black shield, and Leona's cooldowns are so much shorter than Morgana's cooldowns that really, if Morgana is ever forced to use the black shield, she's in trouble for the next 18 seconds or so. So as I've been telling you, Darkside takes this fight that Degenerate Exiles completely turns around. They pile all of their gold onto their Kaisa, and they manage to shift this into a turning point of the game where the game just absolutely shifts in its favor for degenerates. I mean, they managed to steal a dragon and then win the ensuing team fight quite handily, very much thanks to some of that gold that got onto Kaisa. They wind up transitioning all of this momentum into a Baron, which they then apply pressure to the base of Darkside right before their Soul Drake. Now, I do have a bit of a complaint here, though. Now, typically, when you have Baron and you are trying to push those Baron waves as far into your opponent's space as you can, one of the things that you're doing is you're eyeing the timer for the next objective, probably a dragon, in this case, the potential Soul Dragon for degenerates. And you are trying to make your opponent spend so much time in their base that they cannot effectively contest that dragon. However, degenerates spent enough time pushing their waves that I feel like they rotated to the top lane and spent a little more time there than they really actually had time to, as they, who were supposed to be in control of the tempo of the game, actually show up to their own dragon late. And given they're playing from blue side, this is pretty dangerous. Of course, in the end, it doesn't amount to anything too throwy, as Jisoo just casually steals the second dragon of the game, securing the soul, and the Degenerate Exiles essentially run into Darkside's base afterwards and claims their prize. But, you know, if I am being particularly picky, I have to ask why Degenerate Exiles even left that up to chance. I mean, they were in control of the tempo. They could have showed up to that dragon first. They could have maintained control of that area. They didn't have to risk losing vision control. They didn't have to risk getting picked out as they tried to gain vision control into the river coming into that pit from the blue side. And they didn't have to pin their potential soul on Jisoo managing to grab that steal. I don't know what they were discussing. It is entirely possible that Jisoo said to his team, hey, let's spend some extra time just really crashing these waves in, because I can assure you I will get this dragon and we can spend this extra time up here top lane. But to me, that just introduced an unnecessary margin to error. It looks very much just like a plain mistake from my perspective. And I can't say I agree with this, whether it was intentional or not, that they introduced this unnecessary margin for error when they had control of the tempo of the game. But I won't complain too much. We shall see more of them later, and we'll see whether this becomes a pattern for Degenerate Exiles. Let's move on to the other set, Divine Ascension Ruby against Legendary Wolves. So this is another set that sees a substitute. Epps subs top lane for Cute Raichu. So this game sees Divine Ascension Ruby fielding Mordekaiser, Pantheon, Zoe, Tristana, and Maokai. This is significant in part because they decided to play some mind games in their draft. The first thing they did was they first picked themselves a Maokai. Next, they picked themselves Tristana and Pantheon, which you might notice are all flex picks. This is not a bad strategy. I mean, if you have players with the relevant champion pools, it can be really fun and interesting to flex pick around to try to give yourself an advantage in draft. However, I'm not sure they really used this to great effect, and it simply could have been some bad luck on their part. After all, as we don't know these teams super well, these teams don't really know each other particularly well. But it seems that Divine Ascension Ruby didn't quite manage to leverage this mind trickery into any particularly significant advantages. Legendary Wolves get their hands on Ornn, Skarner, Syndra, Kai'Sa, and Nami. By all means, it really looks like Legendary Wolves got their hands on exactly what they wanted to, and they didn't seem to particularly suffer for it either. After all, it's not like Kai'Sa Nami, a bot lane that you very much telegraph that you are depending on them having an impact somewhat early in the game when you pick this bot lane. That Tristana Maokai is not a terrifying bot lane to be playing that Kai'Sa Nami into. So I can't help but ask, Divine Ascension Ruby, what was it all for? Getting into the game itself, one of the first things I noticed upon viewing this game is simply the maxim that silly goose is a silly goose. And by this I mean, this is an incredibly apt name for this player. He is an aggressive player, particularly on Tristana. I wonder if this is just, to some ADC players, Tristana is like Lee syndrome, where they are way too excited to use that rocket jump to go in, and it's very much a double-edged sword where it occasionally gets them these really impressive looking kills where they look untouchable, and on the other hand, sometimes they just get blown up and look like an absolute fool. Well, Silly Goose does secure first blood by quite impressively blowing all sums and jumping to essentially the other side of Legendary Wolf's turret to get that first blood kill onto a Kai'Sa, who similarly has to blow her sums in an attempt to survive the trade. While Skarner later picks up this kill as Silly Goose tries to waltz back into his own lane in the side of the jungle, that trade overall still absolutely benefits Divine Ascension Ruby. After all, Tristana is a worthy champion to get an extra first blood chunk of cash onto. And while Legendary Wolves would have been in an even worse spot if, say, Nami had gotten that kill instead of Skarner, it is still not perhaps ideal, right? The ideal situation might have been that Kai'Sa did get the return kill, but that didn't even happen. She got an assist for her troubles, but that's not quite enough. After all, the wave does crash into her turret, and she loses enough for that whole ordeal. Now, Silly Goose, I think, quite clearly felt emboldened by that positive turn of events, or perhaps this is simply Silly Goose's playstyle, where he really likes jumping in on Tristana, and really I can't blame him. If you're a Tristana player, that is one of the few joys in your life. Because he later pulls essentially the same move to kill Kai'Sa again. Epic Fail Guy 456 on this Kai'Sa is clearly not having a great time playing into Tristana in this laning phase at that point. However, Silly Goose does display the double-edged sword aspect of this mentality a little bit later into the game, around 18 minutes. See, Divine Ascension Ruby winds up sieging against Skiz's Syndra and Fitz Chivalry's Nami. They're both low health. And they're trying to fend off a siege of 3 while, Epic Fail Guy is doing who knows what, ADCs in their farm, right? Well, Eps TPs in on Ornn and really forces this engage. Like, this is a hard force of an engage, where when I viewed this, I couldn't help but be very nervous on behalf of Legendary Wolves, where it wasn't immediately evident to me that they were going to get a ton for this, as Ornn did have to just sort of face tank 3 people for a significant amount of time before his team was able to show up. But as it turns out, my concerns were for naught, as Ornn just sort of is Ornn. It's not a fair champion. And has no problem really tanking all of that damage, as his team is able to collapse onto the Divine Ascension Gaming Siege players. And what's worse is that Silly Goose decides to be a silly goose again and just sort of launches straight into that fight and gets obliterated by Legendary Wolves. I mean, really just handing over free gold here. You know, you live by the rocket jump and you die by the rocket jump. Of course, this beneficial fight for Legendary Wolves wasn't inherently game-changing at the moment that it occurred. Divine Ascension Ruby had no problem taking the soul, but it just so happens that they were, and perhaps this is a trend for them, they seemed emboldened by this to really try to lay claim on more ground on the map than they really had any right to. They position just a little too far up into the wolves' jungle, and they have a member who gets picked. Even worse, they fail to give wolves the space and the respect that they deserve over trying to maintain their position next to this Baron. And they just kind of give up even more gold as a result, as the Legendary Wolves take even more kills after Divine Ascension Ruby just sort of doesn't give up the space that they have to as a result of that initial pick. And guess what? I mean, that's a throne Baron right there, but a throne Baron does not necessarily a throne game make. After all, Divine Ascension Ruby does regroup sufficiently by the time it is time to contest the Elder Dragon. And this is sort of an extended, intense, and tense period of time where this Elder Drake has 2 team fights over it. One might even say 2.5 or 3. See, initially, Taeyeon Zoe gets some pretty good poke before they start their initial fight, and essentially carries that team fight, which extends long enough for Zoe to get enough rotations on those disgusting, horrible combos. And Tae picks up a triple kill for his efforts and winds up being the only survivor of that fight, being just a plain old Zoe, of course. He can't take the Elder Dragon, and there doesn't wind up being anything in the base he can do, so he more or less kind of chills around the Elder Dragon, takes blue buff for his troubles, and waits for the next team fight, where Divine Ascension Ruby actually sets up something of a Fnatic Death Brush, and to me it's really funny when a Fnatic Death Brush just kind of results in nothing, which is what happens here. A lot of spells get blown in an attempt to accelerate the fight and just immediately claim their free Elder Dragon, but that's not what happens. Really, even though Divine Ascension Ruby does catch Legendary Wolves off guard with a Death Brush, no one dies from it, so both sides just sort of reset and get ready for the ensuing team fight. And of course, that team fight goes somewhat similarly to the last, and Tae doesn't get a triple kill, but does get a double kill, so definitely does more than his fair share of leg work in this team fight. and puts out more than enough damage, and Divine Ascension Ruby happens to secure their prize of both the Elder Dragon and the game. You know, I've been talking about Tay enough here, where I should at least give Mordekaiser some credit for doing that thing that Mordekaiser is supposed to do when you're contesting objectives, and kidnap Skarner. Of course, I just find it somewhat ironic that Mordekaiser and Skarner are both essentially kidnap champions, so Mordekaiser kidnaps the kidnapper. I just find that relatively amusing. So that more or less wraps up game 1 of this set. So let's move on to game 2 of Divine Ascension Ruby versus Legendary Wolves. Game 2 sees Divine Ascension Ruby on Jax, J4, Seraphine, Kaisa, and Galio, whereas Legendary Wolves get their hands on Renekton, Olaf, Akali, Aphelios, and Lulu. I won't say too much about this game, as it is an early bloodbath near the bot lane. Technically, Divine Ascension Ruby gets the first blood, but that gold goes over to the support Galio, which is not really the greatest person to be putting that money onto. And overall, Legendary Wolves get more kills out of the whole trade, and they just sort of transition this early bloodbath into a fiesta. I will give Divine Ascension Ruby credit where credit is due. You know, if it wasn't bad enough that Legendary Wolves had a lead, Aphelios Lulu were ahead. That is a disgusting bot lane to try to play against when they get their hands on just a little bit of cash. And at some point, Aphelios has the misfortune of existing as an AD carry near his own turret. And Divine Ascension Ruby sends 4 people bot lane to just sort of wipe him off the face of the map. It works. However, getting a shutdown on Legendary Wolves Aphelios is not enough to get Divine Ascension Ruby back into this game, as Legendary Wolves just spend basically the entire game being incredibly ahead. They more or less stomp, and in the immortal words of Cowboy Casts, why did Jax get one-shot by an Akali? Well, this concludes our games for week 1 of Mid-League. Let's go ahead and look what occurred in Heavy League. So the first set, we see Catalyst Blaze against Akuma Glaives. Wow, I'll say that multiple times next to each other between Blaze and Glaives. That is just asking for a tongue twister. Blaze drafts Shen, Hecarim, Anivia, Jhin, and Swain. Akuma Glaives gets their hands on Sion, Graves, Echo, Vayne, and Maokai. Of course, everything kind of goes wrong on the side of production this game. Week 1, am I right? So technically, first blood of this game occurs while the stream is down. My understanding is that whatever happened during that fight, the relevant knowledge is that Graves, that's a superstar for Akuma Glaives, spends that first blood fight just continuing an invade he already had going and using the time to take the Rift Herald. This is significant insofar as later on in this game, Graves actually manages getting a ridiculous, and I truly mean ridiculous, amount of gold. I mean, later on, there's just, talk about jungle difference, right? I do believe this was the game in which we actually saw a flame horizon. I could be wrong. No, yeah, that's right. I wrote it down in my notes. In just under 25 minutes, Graves eventually passes the threshold to have a true, genuine flame horizon over Hecarim. It is wild. I remember looking at the CS count and just waiting for it to tick above that 100 CS difference threshold. So once the stream came back, even though we didn't see first gold, though we didn't see first blood, we did happen to see a very relevant, perhaps more relevant fight. A very exciting 4v4 which occurred in the bot lane, where Glaives wind up taking 4-0. See, despite whatever occurred in that initial first blood fight, Graves does gank for his bot lane. And Nightstar on that vein condemns Swain into a wall and gets the kill. I mean, there's some good plays going on here on behalf of Akuma Glaives, but I must say, Catalyst Blaze, I love you guys, but what were you doing there? Kael'ma TPs in as a Nivea and immediately has to flash out of that TP. Kael'ma gets his egg cracked and dies. I mean, you probably heard all that you really needed to hear when I told you that Glaives got 4-0, but that fight just sort of really cemented this lead on behalf of Akuma Glaives. Graves got his hand on a super early mythic item, allowing them to just have fun, constantly forcing fights, diving turrets. It was kind of a great time. I will say, it looks like Glaives was a little too eager to toy with their food. They definitely had the opportunity to end the game earlier than they did, but they kind of just backed off of a 2/3 health nexus to take a Baron for funsies, I guess, and end the game. I can't say that's necessarily great form, but I'd also be lying if I said I'd never done that. So, game 2. Well, I would like to say it changed a bit, but it didn't. Glaives got a 2-0. I really don't know what else to tell you about this. I mean, Glaives also decide to first pick their Rumble. And this is actually a Rumble who goes into the top lane, which is not something I've seen for a while. But the thing about Rumble players is if you care to play Rumble, you're probably pretty terrifying on him. So I'll be interesting to see if this Rumble really ever starts drawing bans, or alternatively, perhaps reliably carrying games. Either would be something that's very interesting to see. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and take a look at the Vlad Banners Only versus Lotus set. So this is the only set which was streamed with both teams being returning. VBO versus Lotus is a very fun matchup to see. I mean, that's what our finals was last season. VBO was, of course, victorious. That's why I called them our returning champions. But these are players that really produce very interesting games against each other, in my opinion. I mean, after all, Lotus is the team fighting team. And VBO isn't necessarily bad at team fighting. I mean, they can pull off some gorgeous team fights themselves, but they aren't quite so tied to the team fighting style. And if I may zoom out a little bit and look at the overview of this set, this is a 1-1 set where Lotus win the first game and VBO wins the second game. But notably, Vlad Banners Only win the second game because they employ split push. And this is something that's really nice for me to see, because I am very much of the opinion that the most reliable way to beat Lotus is to employ a split push strategy against them. It's not easy because they actually do deal with split push relatively well. They are not particularly weak to split push. They actually manage their rotations somewhat well when they are faced with split push. But again, I said that Lotus is a very teamfight oriented team. I would argue, and I don't think I'm entirely wrong to do so, that Lotus is probably the best teamfighting team that XLNC ever sees. It honestly kind of drives me crazy when I watch their team fights, and particularly when they roam to follow up on something that's going wrong. Like, you know, it kind of looks like a Lotus member is getting picked, but then they manage to stall just enough time to transition that into a beneficial trade. These are players who seem to really and truly understand each other, both in terms of what they need from each other in terms of rotations and trading off various boons and banes. But their team fights look seamless consistently. I mean, we have some teams in XLNC that can pull off some pretty impressive team fights. But if you ask me, Lotus does it with a consistency that we don't really see from anyone else. I don't know what the secret is, really. I mean, I'm sure both the coaching staff and the players are involved here. But I don't know what is the dominant force here, right? Is Lotus coaching staff just like secretly gods at creating team fighting players? Or is the power of friendship alone fueling the Lotus players' team fight? I really can't tell. I mean, the Lotus players do definitely seem to work well together and seem very content to play together. And, you know, again, I'm a big softie. I'm a sucker for friendship storylines, which is one of the reasons I've grown to really like watching Lotus team fights. Also, of course, Lotus just notoriously wins every single time I bet against them, so they really just exist to make me look like a fool. Like, I didn't need help looking like a fool. I do that on my own, but it's nice to see a team win so consistently every time I bet against them. Just to do their set justice, I would like to go over kind of what occurred in these games. And I think game one is, well, it's definitely an interesting game to look, and it's not one-sided by any means. It's a pretty good game of League of Legends to watch, but essentially, Lotus, the team fighting team, decided to team fight and then won the game. Game two, however, Lad Banners Only does decide to pull out the split push. And the last time that I remember looking at the employee of a split push composition against Lotus, we saw CGC trying to just completely ban out Crooked Serpent, which cannot be done, as a matter of fact. They play just a few too many champions for that, and Crooked Serpent is very much a supportive style player, which we do stand in the top lane, of course. Lotus loves playing around JVL, and guess what? It kind of always works. Even when they put JVL on Galio, as they did in game two, JVL still showed a pretty impressive performance. So it's not that JVL has to play a carry champion. He just kind of is a carry style player with the secondary support of knowing that his bot lane is also really good at doing a lot of damage safely. So you have this dynamic in Lotus, which seems to be an incredibly supportive top lane with a jungler doing whatever the heck they need jungle to do, which is often either spam gank for JVL or just stall fights long enough for JVL to also come rotate or TP in and take the kills. I mean, something that was kind of funny is I was watching this VOD with a friend of mine, right? And she had never seen Lotus play before. In game 1, Lotus got a Twisted Fate. And in game 2, or actually, am I getting this mixed up? I might be getting the order mixed up, actually. Yes, I am actually lying to you. In game 1, Lotus gets the Galio. In game 2, Lotus gets the Twisted Fate. So I actually got that backwards a little bit earlier. Apologies. I think I might have made the erroneous claim that Lotus lost when JVL was on Galio, but that is incorrect. Apologies there. There's just too many Galios to look at, as in game 2, VBO actually took that Galio. But anyhow, in game 1, JVL gets Galio. Game 2, JVL gets Twisted Fate. My friend Kat says to me, "This man only plays champions with global ultimates." It was really funny to hear her say that, because it made me recall some plays from the previous season that involved basically all of Lotus just sort of sitting around waiting for JVL to TP in to take a kill once a fight was already decided, which of course for them was the right play. They really enjoy piling their gold onto JVL, but is simply quite amusing to see. And when my friend exclaimed, "This guy only plays global teleporting champions," it made me realize just how much that is somewhat integral to JVL and Lotus as a whole, their team style. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch the rest of the heavy leagues contend with. Perhaps create strategies against. I would like to see a lot more teams than did last season attempt this split push strategy against Lotus, because I think at this point it is more than enough proven that it is a very, well, if not just the most reliable strategy to give Lotus some grief. And split push team styles are inherently a bit harder to coordinate than just a plain team fight. After all, you need to get preemptive vision to avoid just getting collapsed on or rotated on at the wrong time. You really want to know things always before they happen. But then because you're not always grouped as 5, it becomes a bit more inherently dangerous to try to acquire that vision. But Vlad Banners only did that quite well. Shout out to Stingus on the Jax there, who really did a lot of the legwork in pulling that VBO victory out from Lotus with the split push. So that concludes our time for looking at all of those games. I have spent a lot of time talking to you about what games happened in League of Legends. Well, one day very soon, we'll actually be covering even more games, which means I'm going to have to give up Indubitably's insights, which is, again, I love alliterations. Often more me talking about whatever I want and to whomever I want. than necessarily being overly insightful, but who cares? It's an alliteration. I want it. Alas, I may have to drop this segment in favor of simply covering Light League. So while I still have it, welcome to Indubitably's Insights. While I'm monologuing, there is absolutely no one to stop me here. And this indeed is going to be less insightful and more a commercial. See, there is something that struck me as I was watching the mid-league VODs. My attention was captured not by the gameplay, but by Cowboy casts. Watching this alongside my friend, the only thing we'd ever comment on, it seemed, was just things that Cowboy said. He's kind of fantastic, and I love him. He's new to XLNC. I'm so glad that we've picked him up because he is making Mid-League a really fun place and a really entertaining show. If you don't watch Mid-League already, I personally think Cowboy Casts is enough reason alone to start. Now, of course, credit goes to the entire production team and on-air talent for Mid-League. After all, Cowboy's style would not work at all if he did not have his other casters and analysts to bounce off of and contrast with. After all, we can't all constantly say the wonderful gems that Cowboy says without just creating an environment that is simply way too much. Too much caster fiesta. But since I'm making a commercial for Cowboy Casts anyhow, I actually went through the Mid-League VOD an additional time than I otherwise would have just to write down Cowboy quotes. And so I want to share with you my top 3 favorite things that Cowboy Casts said in week 1. So we're going to start with I think the longest quote here, which is, "Peekaboo, here I am. I'm taking ya Zoe, and I'm taking ya Pantheon. See ya later, alligator." Why? This is an explanation of what was happening in the game. I mean, if you didn't piece it together, which I wouldn't blame you, this was Cowboy's reaction to a Skarner kidnap. But wow, that's just a lot. Just so much was going on there. Number 2 here is, of course, as I always say, the game is never over until the shiny rock explodes. It seems that Cowboy very much enjoys calling the Nexus a shiny rock, and I may or may not just rip this off of him and start saying it myself to my friends as we play League of Legends, because as we all know, the best jokes are stolen. And number 1, which I think is my favorite, I think what I just saw was something really cool, called a crime. Am I too easy to please as an audience member? I feel like you just, crack a couple of jokes and I, suddenly stand you forever. But, I will say, in my defense of how much I enjoyed all of this, that my friend Kat was having a great time as well. I mean, everything we said during all of our mid-league viewing was basically variations on, wow, Cowboy's the best. So Cowboy, if you are listening, if you didn't know already, you have a fan base. I can confirm that it is at least a 2-person fan base. So congrats, you have fans. I'm one of them. Please let me chair your fan club. Everyone who is viewing, I actually have a plea for you on this front. I can almost never watch Mid-League live. I would love it if those of you who do would actually tweet me when Cowboy says things like this. Just find a ridiculous Cowboy quote, tweet it to me, Just the quoth cowboy, and then tag me in it. I just want to read out of context cowboy quotes before I have any clue what happened in these games. That would just absolutely make my week. Please do it. That being said, I've been talking at you for enough time, so thank you so much for tuning in. Please let me know what you think about this style of podcast, and we shall see you next week. Thank you very much.